welcome back to my channel, and despite the fact that I've always said this is a channel about television and the past video was about musicals, this video is also about a musical. I promise there is more content coming about things that aren't musicals, but that just seems to be where we are right now, so just go with me on this one. I've been watching a lot of musical theatre and listening to a lot of musical theatre soundtracks since we went into lockdown almost a year ago now. So I feel like this is just kind of where my head is, but I promise we're going to be getting back to television soon. Although I have to say, today when I'm recording this, it's the 5th of February, and I've spent all morning just watching that Hanford Parish Council video on repeat and reading all the memes about it, so at the moment that's my favourite TV show, so I would love to do a deep dive into the Hanford Parish Council, but we'll see if there's any more videos of them having arguments and kicking each other out of Zoom meetings anytime soon. I really hope there is. I hope their February meeting is just as much of a disaster as the past two have been. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're looking at a particular musical that is, I would say, pretty underrated for a start, but actually not that well known. Even when I look it up, there isn't even a Wikipedia page about it, so that's, you know, a good sign that something is not really very well known. And it's Lizzie the musical. So the concept is that it is a musical, a rock musical, about the story of Lizzie Borden, who is one of America's most famous true crime figures, I would say is the best way to put it. I was going to say one of America's most famous murderers, but that's the whole point, is that Lizzie Borden was never actually declared guilty of the murders that she was suspected of, so we can't say that she's a murderer, because we don't know, and we genuinely don't. We can't ever, I don't think we'll ever be able to prove one way or another who actually committed these murders, and so she's not a murderer, she's just someone who's well known for maybe being a murderer. But that's why she is so famous, and it's because she is part of this an unsolved mystery, but one that is from the 1800s, so like a really old unsolved mystery. Not quite as old as Who Killed Tutankhamun, but you know, old. So let's first just recap, just in case you don't know who Lizzie Borden is. And if you don't, there are plenty of things that you can look at if you want to learn more about Lizzie. We are going to be talking a lot about the actual case in this video, so you know, feel free to stick around and you'll learn. But there are also other places if you want to learn more about Lizzie before you watch this or after you watch this. I first discovered Lizzie Borden from a BuzzFeed Unsolved video. Now, it's actually a BuzzFeed Unsolved Supernatural episode as opposed to true crime, because they were visiting her house, which is now like a museum dedicated to her, and trying to see if they could contact her ghost. But actually, I was far more interested in the story because I'd never heard of Lizzie Borden before that. And I realised that in America she is like a really well-known true crime figure, but in the UK I've never really come across a lot of information about Lizzie Borden. I suppose in the UK we're just more interested in our own killers, you know what I mean? Like, you know, if people like Harold Shipman or the Yorkshire Ripper or Jack the Ripper, you know. So I've never really heard of Lizzie before this, but I thought it was really interesting. But of course, because it was a supernatural video, they didn't really do a massive deep dive into the actual case. But I ended up watching, Stephanie Harlow is my favourite true crime YouTuber. I highly recommend, if you're into true crime, check her out. Her videos are incredible and she gets really deep into cases. Like, she goes way back, looks at their childhood, looks at the lives of like their family, their parents, and tries to kind of build this complete picture of how we got to this crime. Not just the crime itself, but everything that might have contributed to the crime happening. So she did a really good deep dive into the life of Lizzie Borden and the crime itself, and that was really where I became like fascinated with Lizzie. So when I discovered there was a Lizzie Borden musical and that it was a rock musical, this was the greatest moment of my life. I discovered it through Catherine Steele. She's also a YouTuber, she does musical theatre content. And she mentioned it in one of her videos about an underrated musical. She was like, not a lot of people know about Lizzie the musical. She's also where I discovered Bear, just out of interest. My last video was on Bear, a pop opera, and I actually discovered that from the same video that I discovered Lizzie the musical from. So Catherine Steele is to blame for a lot of my musical theatre taste. I hope she knows that. So yeah, so let's just recap what we're actually talking about today, what we're going to be looking at. So Lizzie Borden is an important figure in American true crime history because she was accused of brutally murdering her father and stepmother in 1892 in their own home. But after a trial, she was acquitted, declared not guilty, and because of that, and because they never had another suspect, it's meant that the case has just been left unsolved for over 100 years now. And considering how long it's been, the chances are we are never going to be able to find out who actually murdered Andrew and Abby Borden. And even at the time, there was just so little evidence to actually tie Lizzie or anyone else to the murder. I don't think they ever would have been able to come to a conclusion. They said that despite the fact that Lizzie definitely seemed suspicious, and, you know, that is undeniable, there wasn't actually any way to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's what the rule is, that to prove someone guilty, you have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they are guilty. There was no way to prove that. There was not enough evidence, physical evidence, or even close to like real evidence that could tie Lizzie unequivocally to the murder. There were only 2 people in the house at the time, other than the 2 people that got murdered. And there wasn't DNA evidence in the way that there is now, and there just wasn't really any way to confirm that Lizzie had killed them or that anyone else had. So it just got left unsolved. So that's Lizzie's life. Now the musical itself, I'll give you a bit of background. So it first was performed in September of 2009, and on its website, this is how it's described. Lizzie is 4 women fronting a 6-piece rock band. Lizzie is rage, sex, betrayal, and bloody murder. Lizzie is American mythology set to blistering rock score. Lizzie is a new American musical with a sound owing less to Sondheim and Andrew Lloyd Webber than to Bikini Kill, The Runaways, and Heart. And that is a pretty good summary. Lizzie is definitely unique in the way that it's presented. It's not a musical in the way that you would expect. It's not got, you know, big sets, and it's not got like a lot of kind of I don't want to say not acting, but there's not really a lot of acting. It is more like a concert. It's more like a rock concert than it is a musical. It's very minimalist set. There's only things like, there's one chair that they use in like every scene. There's like a couple of tables that they lift on every now and then. There's a big kind of blanket, like fitted sheet, that they use in a few scenes. But honestly, there's not really a lot in terms of stage production. It is more like a concert, and there's only 4 characters. There's only 4 actresses, and they play a character each, and they tell the whole story. So it's very minimalist. You know, we're not talking a cast like, you know, Hamilton or like Joseph. You know, we're not talking loads of characters here. We're talking 4 people telling an entire story, and also all of those characters are women, so it's a completely female musical. It's about a female murder told by women, and it was written by a man, so, you know, it's not as if it's coming from a female perspective, but it's told from, it's told by women, and it's told by female characters, so it's definitely a very, I don't know if empowering is the right word, because I'm not sure you should aspire to be a murderer, but it's just a really good musical for women. I think it's you know, if they ever put on a production of that, and you are into musical theatre, you want to be in the musical theatre, and you have the chops to do it, then that's a great one to be in, because that's definitely a place where you're going to be able to excel as a woman in theatre, is what I'm trying to say. And personally, I think that Lizzie is absolutely incredible. Like, the music is phenomenal, the girls that are in it are incredible, like, their voices are wonderful, and the costumes are fantastic. So the way that it's done, the first act of the show, they're wearing like typical Victorian era dresses, so, you know, big bustles and lots of layers. But then in the second act, after the murders have been committed, they're wearing like leather, and like Lizzie's typical dress is like it's like a leather corset with like a cutout bit to show off her cleavage, and then like a net skirt with like fishnet tights underneath. It's incredible. So they just look like big biker women. Like, they look awesome. They look so good. So that it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And like when they're meant to be having the murder scene, like the girl that plays Lizzie is actually just like smashing watermelons so that there's like chunks of like flesh flying across the stage, but it's just chunks of watermelon. It's just wonderful. It deserves to be seen. If you ever get the chance to watch it or go and see it live, I absolutely recommend it. But what we're going to be doing today is talking about how Lizzie the musical compares to the actual story of Lizzie Borden. So we're going to be looking at the story of Lizzie, the crime that she allegedly committed, but through the eyes of this musical. Now, there are definitely creative liberties taken with this. It's not a perfect retelling. There are definitely some bits that are included purely for entertainment. There's a kind of romantic subplot that definitely didn't exist in the historical recounts. There's nothing to ever suggest that this existed. So, definite creative liberties, but I don't think that's a bad thing, because there's a difference between something being made to educate and something being made to entertain. So just because something is based on history doesn't mean it has to be completely factually correct, as long as it's never claiming to be. If you're out here saying this is like a perfect retelling of the story of Lizzie Borden but in song, then that would be a disingenuous thing to say. But if you're saying we made this musical based on a well-known American story, but we've changed it up and added our own flair to it, and I think considering it's a rock musical and girls are wearing leather, you know, you'd be wrong to think that this would be anything but its own flavour, you know? Then there's nothing wrong with that, because it's your interpretation, it's your telling, it's your version of a story. And everyone who tells the story of Lizzie Borden tells it slightly differently, because she is, at this point, a legend. She was a real person. We know she existed. There are photos and you can find her on, like, Ancestry. But the story surrounding her has become encased in myth. And there's always new elements added that are just not from the original telling. And that's the thing, is that I think the real story of Lizzie Borden does get lost over time. But as long as you're making it for entertainment and you're not trying to perfectly recount the story, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, if you look at something like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, it is an incredibly faithful, in some ways, telling of Arthurian legend, far more faithful than a lot of adaptations of Arthurian legend. But I don't think the real King Arthur, if he ever existed, had you know, singing knights at Camelot, and I don't think that they ran around using coconuts as horses, and there wasn't an evil rabbit that tried to maul them all. You know what I mean? Like, there's a difference between being historically educational and historically entertaining. So, there is a lot of creative differences in Lizzie the musical from the real story of Lizzie, but I think it's really good at getting across the emotion that would have existed at the time, and just making a really good, enjoyable musical. And at the end of the day, as long as your musical's good and everyone enjoys it, I don't think anybody can moan about it. But with that said, let's get into it. So, just before we start, let me just explain the characters so that you get a good idea of who's singing each song. So we've got 4 women playing the 4 central characters. We've got Lizzie Andrew Borden. Now, at the time, she was 32 years old, and she was the youngest daughter of Andrew Jackson Borden and his first wife, Sarah Anthony Morse. We also have her older sister, Emma Lenora Borden, who was 41 years old, and she was the oldest daughter of Andrew and his first wife, Sarah. We have Bridget Sullivan, who was the Borden family maid. She was 25 years old, and she was an Irish lady who the sisters called Maggie, allegedly because they had a previous maid called Maggie, and they just couldn't be bothered learning Bridget's name. Which sounds horrible, but as someone who once had a job where everyone kept calling me the wrong name because I took over from the girl before me, I can entirely believe that happened. And the final character is Alice Russell, who is Lizzie and Emma's neighbour and a good friend of the 2 girls. So what we're going to be doing is looking at each song and comparing how the events in the song compare to the actual events of August 1892, when Andrew and Abby Borden were brutally murdered. So let's get right in with the first song, 40 Wax, Prologue. Just to let you know, I'm reading off a script, so if you see me staring down, it's because I'm reading. Normally I don't script my videos, I tend to just ramble off the top of my head, but if I tried to ramble this entire musical score off the top of my head, I would completely lose track of what the hell I was doing, so I've scripted this one. So if you see me staring down, it's because I'm looking at my laptop screen. I can hear a noise. As soon as I started talking there, my window cleaner came to my door, so I had to go and let him round the back. So, I'll just start again, will I? Yeah, so let's look at the first song, 40 Wax, Prologue.
Lizzie Borden took the gave her mother 40 wax.
So this is the opening number of the show, and it's not an original technically. So 40 Wax is a popular American skipping song for children based on the Lizzie Borden story. It's in itself historically inaccurate in that there were nowhere near 40 whacks given to Abby or Andrew Borden. The song says Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks, which for a start isn't right because it's not her mother, it's her stepmother. And when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. And again, it wasn't that many. But I think everyone associates that song with Lizzie Borden. Like, everyone in America knows that little tune, so I think if you hadn't included it in the musical, it would seem weird. It's also during the prologue that each character introduces themselves, and we don't know it yet, but these are actually the introductions that they give while doing their testimonies in court later on in the show. So we'll come back to them later, but they each introduce themselves and say what their role is in this story. So you know, Bridget mentions that she's the maid, Alice mentions that she's their friend, Emma says she's Lizzie's sister, and then there's Lizzie. So let's move on to the first kind of big song of the show. This, I suppose you could say, is the opening number, because the other one's the prologue, because this is the song that sets the scene for the entire musical.
Let us take you to an August back in 1892, when all hell broke loose in the House of Borden.
So House of Borden introduces not only the characters, but the situation in the Borden house. It sets the context for this entire story and why these things might have happened. And we learn very quickly that there is definitely unrest within the Borden family and why that is. The song opens with a chorus which mentions the atmosphere in the home. It says that there's a lock on every door in the Borden house and that everyone is involved in a long silent war. From what I can find, this does seem to be the case to an extent. The Bordens did actually install locks on their bedroom doors, I suppose for privacy from each other, which would suggest there's something wrong with the family dynamic, especially in the 1800s, where it was kind of considered that a family should be in each other's business. You know, that you didn't really get a lot of privacy from your family. You live together, sleep together, eat together, you know, you're always in each other's faces. So to have that expectation that you can lock yourself away from your family members wasn't really a typical attitude at the time. But then again, you do have to consider that Lizzie and Emma were in their 30s and 40s at this point in time. So the fact that they were even living with their parents at this point was strange for the time, because you should have been married off and way out living and having children years before this, but these girls didn't marry and they didn't move out. So I suppose you could maybe say that there was a greater expectation for privacy when you're dealing with two fully adult women who are the children, but they're much older than your standard children living at home. And I think that's an interesting thing that we tend to forget about the Lizzie Borden story, is that Lizzie and Emma were not like teenagers. The fact that they were living under their father's roof wasn't because they were too young to move out, they just chose not to. So they were fully grown adults, and Lizzie was in her 30s when she may or may not have committed these murders. So it's not quite the case of like a temperamental teenage girl who's mad at her father. It's a grown woman who has some kind of issue with the family dynamic, and it is interesting to look at. And of course we don't know for definite what that really was like in the house, but it's if Andrew had a lot of control over Emma and Lizzie's lives, you could see why that would be stifling to them when they were too old, really, for their father to be telling them what to do. But then again, at that point in time, it was pretty much considered that women were told what to do by the men. So even if they had moved out to live with their husband would have told them what to do the same way that their father did. So it's all the context of the time, and it's hard to look at it from our point of view now and fully understand what was going on when it's just a time that's so far removed from our attitudes today. Later in the song it mentions that Lizzie and Emma live in one half of the house and the parents live in the other, so I think that probably suggests the idea that they were living kind of separate lives, that even though they lived under their father's roof, Lizzie and Emma were trying to make it seem as if they were living on their own by living in a different part of the house, like this is their home, even though it's still attached to their dad's house, but it's like it's not really part of it. But I think it's, again, because of the time, I don't think it would be easy to completely disassociate from your family when you're staying under the same roof. So the first member of the family that we learn about in the song is Andrew Borden, who is Lizzie and Emma's father. The song says that Andrew was miserly with his money and forced the family to reuse old food throughout the week despite it making them sick. It also mentions that to make more of a profit in his undertaker business, he would deliberately charge families for large coffins and then chop their feet off so that they could fit in a smaller coffin, but then charge them for the big one anyway. So the question here is, was Andrew Borden really as stingy as the song makes out? So let's talk about who Andrew Jackson Borden really was. Andrew Borden was the president of a major bank in Fall River, Massachusetts, the town that the Borden family lived in. He was president of Union Savings Bank, director of First National Bank, director of the Durfee Safe Deposit and Trust Company, director of Globe Yarn Mill Company, director of Troy Cotton and Woolen Manufacturing Company, and the director of the Merchants Manufacturing Company. He also owned a number of properties. So from that, we can definitely gather that Andrew was a wealthy man. There's no way you have that much in assets and you're not wealthy. And the Borden family were known for their wealth historically, but Andrew's father himself was actually not a wealthy man. I'm not sure if he'd squandered his wealth or if there had been some kind of family dispute, but for some reason he didn't have the wealth that the other Bordens had, meaning that Andrew actually grew up in poverty. And that forced him, or at least drove him, to want a life of luxury for himself and his family in the future in the way that he never had when he was a kid. And he worked really hard. He was known for working 14-hour days and never taking holidays, that he just worked and worked and worked because he had the ambition to have as much money as possible. And of course, if you want to have as much money as possible, a good way to do that is by not spending it. He didn't really want assets so much. He didn't want luxurious items. He just wanted accumulative wealth. So he was saving his money and not trying to squander it on frivolous things. He just wanted all of that in his bank account so he could look at it and go, look at all my money. But at the same time, if Andrew really wanted to save all his money, he wouldn't have been buying multiple properties. And one of the properties that gets brought up a lot in this case is the one that he actually gifted to the family of his second wife, Abby Borden. He owned a house and he willfully gave it away to them, even though it was part of his, cumulative wealth. Allegedly, it was a family house. It was his father's house, I think, or a wealthy relative's house, but I'm not entirely sure. It could have been one that he bought. I don't know. There's conflicting records. The story about chopping feet off of corpses was a legend at the time in Fall River. People used to talk about how Andrew Borden would chop feet off of corpses to fit them into smaller coffins. But nobody can prove if that was true or if that was just local hearsay. Although you do have to wonder where that legend came from. But everyone's got like the local town person that there's a really weird rumour about. Like, I think we've all had that at some point in our lives.
I think we all say true. Yeah,
like every town has that town weirdo that everyone tells stories about, even though they're probably perfectly nice and don't have any weird qualities at all, but just the whole town seems to think that they've got all these weird stories in their past. And I feel like that's probably the case with Andrew Borden. I find it hard to believe that he chopped feet off of corpses, but at the same time, who knows? Who knows? Maybe he did. The story as well about the mutton is brought up far later, actually in the Lizzie Borden trial, where a family friend suggested that what might have made the Bordens sick on the days leading up to the murders was the fact that Andrew had been reusing mutton for multiple days. So this idea that Monday's mutton supper becomes Tuesday's mutton lunch, and then to take it further, Thursday's breakfast is mutton soup, that apparently was something that happened according to a family friend, was that they were reusing this mutton far longer than you could with no refrigeration, and they didn't have amenities in the house like other houses did, allegedly. Allegedly, Andrew was really stingy, so he wouldn't have bothered investing in anything to try and preserve food. They just left it sitting on the counter and hoped for the best. And considering this was apparently a heat wave, that's not going to be good for meat. But we don't know. So these stories, they all have a basis in history and historical fact, but whether or not they're quite as true as the story makes out, and whether Andrew Borden was as stingy as the legends claim, is debatable. There was definitely wealth in the family. I suppose the question is, if that was the reason that Lizzie and Emma were against their father, was it because he was stingy? Was it because they didn't ever get the benefits of that wealth? Did he not share that wealth with them? Or was that actually nothing to do with it, and that was just a reason that was used to try and excuse the actions of Lizzie, if she did it? Later in the song, we learn more about Lizzie and Emma, the Borden sisters. Bridget describes Lizzie as not the brightest bird, and this comes up a lot. There is a lot of bird motifs for Lizzie throughout the show. She's always kind of represented by birds. So that's another one of these bird motifs, but obviously Bridget is saying that Lizzie's not the smartest person in the world, and that Emma's not so sweet. But then she goes on to say that these aren't her words, it's the reputation that the girls have in the town. And I think that is possibly true. I don't have a lot of records on how Lizzie and Emma were perceived by the people of Fall River, but the fact that they were older women by the standards of the time, and they both lived at home and had never married, probably had gained them a bit of a reputation. Bridget in the song says that they're past their prime, and that would be the case. Like a 30 and a 40-year-old woman who, if a 30 or 40-year-old woman wasn't married because they'd been married and their husband had died or something like that, that would be considered acceptable. But for them to never have married at all and never had any children would be really unusual for the time. And the fact that there was two sisters that were both like that would have probably brought a level of shame on the family, that like, why were your daughters not out contributing to society by popping out more children, you know, and being subservient to men the way that they're supposed to. So I think they probably would have had a bad reputation, despite the fact that they were wealthy and they were obviously known for that. I think there's probably there probably was talk about them in the town. We learn a little bit more about Abby at this point, but actually out of all the characters in the show, Abby's probably the one that we learn the least about. And that's probably because there also aren't a lot of historical records about her. Even in my research, I can't find a huge amount of information about who Abigail Borden actually was. from what I can gather, she was a perfectly nice woman who raised 2 stepdaughters to the best of her ability. But in the show and in the song, Emma basically implies that Abby was someone who was only in the marriage for money. She says that if Abby's in it for the money, she's in for a big surprise. Again, implying that Andrew doesn't share his wealth. But there isn't really anything historically that suggests that Abby was in it for the money. She'd been married to Andrew for, gosh, 20 years at least at this point. Possibly longer. I mean, Emma was 14. I'm not good at maths. Emma was 14 when they got married, and she's 41 at the time of this story. So Andrew and Abby have been together for a long time. So the idea that Abby was only in it for the money just seems a bit far-fetched. I mean, not everyone married for love in the 1800s, but as far as anybody could tell, they were a perfectly happy couple. There was nothing really to suggest that there was a problem in the marriage, or that Abby had any nefarious intentions by entering into the marriage with Andrew. But the idea that we get in the song is that Emma doesn't like Abby because she's trying to take the money from the family. And the reality is that I think by the laws of the time, if Andrew died, his next of kin would have been Abby. So even though he had blood daughters, his wealth probably would have went to his marital partner, because that's just kind of the way it worked back then. But I'm not entirely sure. So I can understand where Emma's coming from, but actually there isn't really a lot of evidence for the toxicity that they seem to put on Abby themselves. We then hear from Lizzie for the first time in this song, and she says how close she is to Andrew, how he gave her the middle name Andrew because he wanted a boy. Now, Lizzie was actually the 3rd Borden daughter, but their middle sister, Alice, died at the age of 2. So by this point, this is the 3rd child that Andrew's had, and all of them have been girls. So I can imagine he was probably wanting a boy. But when he realised that this is probably the last daughter he was, or the last child he was going to have, he was like, I'm just going to give her the name Andrew anyway, because I'm never going to get to give it to any child again after this. And allegedly she gave her father a gold ring, which he wore to this day, she says. And that was a statement that Emma made during the trial. She was trying to vouch for Lizzie's relationship with Andrew, and said about how Lizzie gave her father a ring and that he'd always worn it. And that was evidence that there was a close relationship here. But the way that Lizzie says things in this speech, she makes a comment, she's like, I'm Daddy's little girl now. And it just sounds really unsettling, and you can tell that even though she's talking about how close she is to Andrew, there's something brewing under the surface that's not pure here. There's something wrong in this relationship. And then the song ends with Bridget saying that there's some crazy shite in the house of Borden. And there absolutely is. We're gonna get to some crazy shite as we go on. So the next song is called This Is Not Love, and it expands on the relationship between Lizzie and Andrew that Lizzie just introduced in the previous song. It kind of focuses on Andrew's attitude towards his daughters, the way that he's quite authoritarian with them, but more specifically it refers to his sexual abuse of Lizzie. Now this itself is debated in historian circles. Lizzie never accused Andrew Borden of sexual abuse at any point during her trial, and I honestly, it's hard to say again because we're talking about the 1800s, albeit the late 1800s, but I would think that if you just murdered your father and you wanted to try and make the jury feel for you, telling them about how your father was abusive to you and that you were doing it more as a way of self-preservation than out of sheer malice would be a good way to get them on your side. Although at the same time, Lizzie was completely going with the story that she was innocent and she hadn't done it. So if she'd said that, it probably would have just given her more of a motive. So it's difficult to say. But at the same time, like, sexual abuse in history was quite often seen as the fault of the woman. you know? And in some ways things haven't changed. But, you know, it would be seen as a woman's fault for somehow luring a man in with her wily ways, even if it was her father. So if she brought it up, it might have just been kind of counterintuitive and made her look worse. But then again, in a third way or a fourth way, I don't even know where we're at now with this, ancestral sexual abuse was always considered horrific. And it was usually less viewed as the fault of a woman because it was, like, she would never be trying, or at least you would assume, she wouldn't be trying to seduce her own blood family, like her own father. And so they would kind of see it that it can't really be the woman's fault. But again, we're talking about the 1800s, it's really hard to judge how it would have went if she'd brought this up. But there was never any implication of this. Lizzie never brought it up, Emma never brought it up, it was never mentioned by anyone that knew the family. Bridget didn't talk about it. There was nothing at the time that ever suggested that there was some kind of sexual abuse going on in the house between Andrew and anybody, his daughters, his maid, his wife. You know, there was never any actual record of anybody bringing this up. And as far as I can tell, the theory seems to have come from the press at the time. It seems to have been something that the press put in their papers as a way to maybe explain why Lizzie would have done this. At the time, the idea that a young woman, or a middle-aged woman, would have brutally murdered two people, like, in such a gory fashion, like with an axe, just chopping them to bits, was just seen as shocking. And I mean, it'd still be shocking today, but back then when, sorry, my hair's in my face. Back then when, you know, women were supposed to be like demure and innocent and pure, the idea that a woman could commit such a heinous crime was just seen as outrageous. And so I think the press wanted to find a way to paint it that Lizzie had some kind of motivation that would justify her doing this as opposed to just being pure evil. So they made up this idea, and we know that, you know, press has never changed. It's never been a reliable source when it comes to true crime, because as soon as they either come up with a theory or catch wind of an idea, they'll print it as if it's fact and then, you know, deal with the repercussions later. So I'm not going to take this as gospel. But in the context of the musical, they definitely double down on the idea that Lizzie was sexually abused. And it makes Lizzie more sympathetic, and I suppose it does add a lot to the story to have this element in there. But the reality is that I don't think this was actually a factor. I don't think there was any sexual abuse. I don't think it had anything to, like, I don't think it existed, and I don't think it was in any way a contributing factor to what happened to the Bordens. But in the terms of This Is Not Love, it's a wonderful analysis of the thoughts and feelings of someone who is being abused by someone, especially by someone who claims to love them, because that's what it's about. You know, it's about the fact that her father claims to love her, but this is the way he treats her, and she's saying, this is not love, this is not the way that people express love, this is a form of torture. And they come back round to this topic quite a few times throughout the show. It's a really powerful song, so whether it actually happened to the real Lizzie Borden or not is sort of irrelevant, because it happened to the Lizzie Borden of this story, this musical story, and it's a really emotional take on how she feels having been in this situation. So it's a great song, but it's not historically accurate as far as we know. In this next song, we get to see Alice for the first time since the introduction, and she comes around to visit Lizzie and finds her in a state because she's just, you know, been abused by Andrew. She's singing about how this is not love, and she's upset. So Lizzie expresses to Alice how she needs to escape the boarding house, and this is a thing she talks about a lot throughout the musicals, this need to get out, to fly away, she says, because she's represented by birds. So she just wants to fly away, and she doesn't want to be in that boarding house anymore. She doesn't want to be in the home with Andrew and Abby. She just wants to be anywhere else. But as far as we can tell at this point, Lizzie of the story doesn't seem to have any desire to kill anyone. She's not talking about murdering anyone. She just doesn't want to be there. She's saying she wants to get out, not that she wants to remove her father and stepmother from the equation. Historically, there isn't really a lot to go on with this song. It's just really there to give you an insight into the fictional Lizzie's emotions, and I like that about this musical because we don't really know how the real Lizzie Borden felt, and it's nice to speculate on how she might have felt at the time and how, you know, what her thought process might have been in the days leading up to her possibly committing a murder. But there's not really much to talk about when it comes to this song, so we're just going to move straight on to the next one now.
If you knew that every night I dream of you, if you knew.
If You Knew is an interesting song because it introduces the romance between Lizzie and Alice that's threaded throughout this musical. This comes back over and over again. Now, I'm all for including a lesbian romance, believe me, but the thing about this is that there is no historical evidence, or even really any historical speculation, that there was ever any kind of relationship between Lizzie and Alice. Alice is actually quite a small part of the overall Lizzie Borden narrative. The part that she does have is very significant, in that she was one of the main people that kind of condemned Lizzie in court. So her testimony was really important. But other than that, she really just seems to be someone that they knew, that they were friends with, who happened to come round to try and, like, make them feel more comfortable. The first time she actually appears in the real Lizzie Borden narrative is on the night of the 4th of August after Andrew and Abby had been killed. Lizzie and Emma felt uncomfortable staying in the house by themselves after this gory scene, so Alice came round to stay with them to try and kind of just make them feel more comfortable. But in the musical, she's a much bigger character and plays a much more significant part in Lizzie's life. So If You Knew is about Alice's hidden feelings for Lizzie. But like I say, we don't know a huge amount about Alice Russell in reality. I mean, for all we know, she did harbour feelings for Lizzie, but that's certainly not something that we have any evidence of. And no one's ever really speculated it, because there's nothing in the story that would imply anything existed between Alice and Lizzie other than just friendship. The interesting thing is that Lizzie has had a lot of speculation over the years that she might have been a lesbian. But they put her in same-sex relationship not with Alice, but with Bridget, the maid. I'm not entirely sure where this theory came from originally, but it was explored in a 1984 novel called Lizzie, written by Ed McBain. And his idea was that Lizzie committed the murders due to being caught with Bridget by Abby. So his theory is that if Abby had found out and she kind of reacted with, like, disgust at the idea of Lizzie and Bridget, Lizzie might have killed her in retaliation and then decided that she needed to kill her father to get him out of the way, or because she tried to tell him what happened and he got angry, so she just killed him too. I don't know if there was speculation about Lizzie's sexuality at the time she was alive. It's possible, considering the fact that she never married, that maybe people speculated that the reason that she never married was because she wasn't actually interested in men. But there was never really any speculation about Bridget being anything other than straight, because after she left the Borden house, she went on to marry a man. So I don't really know. The only other thing about Bridget is that she allegedly changed her statement in court. She told her sister when she was dying that she changed her testimony to protect Lizzie. But she could have quite easily just done that out of some kind of loyalty, like as the family's maid, or just because she'd grown to feel sorry for Lizzie, or because she'd actually changed her view on Lizzie. There's not really any, evidence that was because she was romantically involved with Lizzie, but we just don't know. We just don't really know. But I'm not sure why the writers of the musical chose to include a romance between Lizzie and Alice, other than either just for the fun of entertainment or because they wanted to make Alice a more important character, which I suppose she kind of needs to be in a show that only has 4 characters. But there is no historical basis for this at all, unfortunately, if you're a big fan of the Lizzie and Alice romance. I suppose it does form sort of the role that Ed McBain uses in his story, and that part of the reason that Lizzie seems to turn on Andrew is because he might be against her relationship with Alice. It's all subtext. But again, in reality, and even in Ed McBain's book, this wasn't what happened. It was, he thought that Abby had found out about Lizzie and Bridget rather than Andrew finding out about Lizzie and Alice. So I don't really know. But it's a lovely song anyway. It's a really pretty little love song. I mentioned earlier that birds are a motif for Lizzie throughout the musical, and this is definitely most prevalent here in The Soul of the White Bird, because she is the white bird in this question. The reason that they seem to tie Lizzie to birds is because she allegedly loved pigeons, but this is also debated, and we'll get to this later because there's a whole bit of song about birds later on. In terms of The Soul of the White Bird itself, this is a song about Andrew's abuse of Lizzie, again, and the effect it has on her mental stability. So she implies in the lyrics that boys never visit the house because Andrew doesn't let them. Presumably, I would say because he wants Lizzie all to himself, so he doesn't want her distracted by other boys because he considers Lizzie to be his, in a way. She kind of goes into detail about this abuse, and she says things like, "Fingers on my knee, daddy, stop it, stop it, stop it, daddy," which is just really gross. And says that she wants to expose Andrew and his secrets to his stupid little wife. And then she talks about wanting money, which obviously comes back to the idea that Andrew doesn't share his wealth with his daughters. And says she wants a new dress so she can be like the girls up on the hill. You know, implying that she doesn't get to be like the girls, the other rich girls in town, because her dad doesn't give her any money. And then at the end of the song, she says, "Father thinks birds are filthy, but I think they're beautiful." Which is a metaphor that gets brought up later on, because there's a bit later on about birds where he says that they're dark and filthy. But what she's obviously talking about here is she's talking about herself, the white bird. And that he thinks that they're filthy, but she thinks she's beautiful. And that is something that comes up a lot in sexual abuse, is that even the person who's abusing you is saying that, like, you're wrong and you're disgusting, and that's why they have to abuse you, because, you know, because you're filthy and you're disgusting, so they need to put you in your place by abusing you. And so that's how he's making her feel, and possibly that's what he's telling her as well, is that this is your punishment because you're a gross person, so you need to be punished in this form. But she's saying, like, I don't think I'm filthy. I think I'm beautiful. And that is absolutely heartbreaking. Like, that just really, every time I hear it, it kicks me right in the stomach.
Maybe someday your heart will be open.
Up next we have a really kind of quick little song called Maybe Someday, and it only really exists to show that Alice has found out about Andrew's abuse of Lizzie, and that she promises Lizzie that she'll keep her secret safe, and then tells her that maybe someday things will be different.
You are not our mother, and you never will be!
We move quickly on to one of the show's monologue pieces, and there's a few of these throughout the show where it's not a song, it's a chunk of dialogue. And Lizzie is really not dialogue heavy at all, there isn't much, but the bits that they do include are quite significant to the overall story. So the will is the first time we hear from Emma since she was introduced at the start of the show. As a side note, Emma is absolutely my favourite character in the musical because she is completely unhinged. She is so, like, oh, it's just so interesting to listen to because she's just so out of it. So in this particular piece, she's yelling at Abby because Andrew bought Abby's family a house, as I mentioned earlier, and Emma thinks that Andrew shouldn't be giving wealth to his in-laws before his own daughters. And then she turns to Lizzie and says that Andrew's changed his will, meaning that when he dies, Abby will inherit everything, and Emma believes that this is Abby trying to shut her and Lizzie out of the family and out of the family wealth. What this piece kind of introduces is this idea of how Emma is not a stable person and also a really toxic influence on Lizzie. When Emma tells Lizzie about the will, Lizzie just instantly believes her when Emma says, like, that woman is trying to lock them out. Lizzie just goes along with it, and she doesn't ever question maybe Emma's wrong, maybe she's misunderstood, like maybe Andrew has like a different way of getting them their wealth. Like, she never questions it, she just believes instantly that what Emma's saying must be the gospel truth. And it does seem to be sort of accurate, maybe. Emma she isn't someone that we've got a lot of information on, and as far as we can tell, she is quite a stable-minded person. She's not unhinged in the way that the series makes, the musical makes out. And when she was up on the stand at the court, she was quite open about her family and said that she didn't have any issues with her family. She was on good terms with both her parents, so was Lizzie. She did admit that she did resent Abby for the whole thing involving the house, but that it wasn't driving this huge war between the family members the way that both the legend and the musical make out. She seemed quite, like, okay about the whole thing. Like, she wasn't up there ranting about how this woman was trying to steal all their wealth. She was actually quite chill about it. But I can believe that Emma might have been a toxic influence on Lizzie, and that does seem to be the case from some sources. The reason for that was because, if you think about it, when Lizzie was born, she only had 2 years with her birth mother, her mother, before she died, before Sarah died. And then 2 years later, her father remarried Abby Borden. So from the age of 4 onwards, Lizzie's life always had Abby as the mother figure. She had no memories of Sarah Morse. She only ever had Abby Borden as that mother figure in her life. And as far as we can tell, like, from historical records, she was actually quite close to Abby growing up, and she called her mother, and she didn't have this anger towards her. But when she was much older, and people testified to this in court, she said things like, "Don't call her my mother, she's my stepmother, my mother's dead," and said things about her, saying that she was, like, vile, and that, you know, she was, I've got them written down later on, but she said some really horrible things about Abby. So it was clear that at some point in her life, her attitude towards Abby had massively changed, and a lot of people put that down to the influence of Emma. When you think about it, Emma was 14 when Abby came into her life, and so it would be understandable if Emma was not a big fan of this new woman, especially if she'd been, like, Lizzie's main caregiver for the past 2 years, because she was, you know, older and she had this baby sister and she was looking after her. So when another person came in and kind of took over the mothering role, it's understandable that Emma might have felt a bit, you know, put out by that, and she maybe just automatically didn't like this woman who wasn't her mother. She was trying to tell her what to do, and she's thinking to herself, well, you can't tell me what to do because you're not my mother, you're stealing my dad from me. All of the things that children feel when they have a replacement parent figure in their life after, you know, a death or a divorce, whatever. So I think it's easy to kind of speculate that Emma might have been the driving force behind Lizzie's turning on Abby, her stepmother, because Lizzie might have had a perfectly normal relationship with Abby growing up, and then Emma was kind of like saying things like, she's not our real mother, you shouldn't be listening to her, like, you don't need to do what she says, she's not in charge, she's just here to steal all of our money, she's trying to take dad away from us. And we kind of see a bit more of that in the next song, about that kind of way that Emma can quite easily lead Lizzie astray. And I think we don't have absolute evidence that that happened, but I find it quite easy to believe that that was possibly it. That being said, like I mentioned earlier, like, Emma was quite positive about Abby and the family and her testimony, and that could have just been a lie to make Lizzie look better. Or it could be that the way that she felt about Abby had changed over the years. She was in her 40s by now. Maybe she just completely got over it, but Lizzie never had. You know, she might have had that influence on Lizzie when they were younger, But now that she's in her 40s, she's a grown woman, she doesn't really care anymore, you know, what her father does with his life and who he's married to. But Lizzie possibly never let go of that resentment because she was a bit younger. So we don't know. But I do think that that is probably historically accurate to an extent.